So I'm happy to welcome you to our panel discussion tonight. The topic is preaching and politics, so variations on the theme that we have been exploring throughout this week. Our panelists today are Reverend Dr. David Gortner, who is the Associate Dean of Church and Community Engagement and also Professor of Evangelism and Leadership at Virginia Theological Seminary. Reverend Dr. Frank Wade, I asked him how he should be introduced. He said, just everyone call him Sire, and that will be happy. And it's because he's just done too many different things. He was the rector of St. Albans in DC. He was the interim dean of the National Cathedral. He was our interim associate dean of students this past year, and he has done many, many things throughout the church over many years of an illustrious career. And the Reverend Phoebe Roaf, also illustrious, as is David. She is an alum from the class of 08, and I believe started out in New Orleans, your first parish was. And then she now is the rector of St. Philip's in Richmond. Are you also on our board of trustees? I believe you are. Yes, so many hats as well. And she is a peer group facilitator for one of the Pioneer cohort groups, which is just finishing up their work. So it's a great honor to welcome all three of you. I think our format ought to be that each of you would talk for maybe 15 minutes on the topic of preaching and politics, and then we will open up the time for conversation among all of us. Okay. Shall we just...
Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'd like to begin by opening up the word politics first and have some discussion about what politics is and the political is and what it is not. In the shooting today cast some interesting light on this. The Republicans and Democrats were there to, this was their practice for a game that they will still have, of playing baseball against each other. Nice sportsmanlike kind of thing to do, and not always what we hear or see in the public eye. And someone was talking to the Capitol Police who were there at the practice and asked the question, "Oh, who's out on the field, Republicans or Democrats?" And then began shooting. In the world of community organizing, which I spend some time in, there is a strong emphasis on the distinction between the political and the partisan. Political is our public life where there are different agents and different sources of power competing, contending, cooperating, trying to make things happen. And so the political is the world in which those things meet. The partisan is decidedly linked to ideology. And so that becomes the template by which the dynamics of public life are viewed, one way or another. And it's through partisanship that one ends up with long-term, set, unyielding ideas about the right way and the wrong way to do things. The political involves more a moment-by-moment or situation-by-situation adjustable stance toward solving the problems that face us. Okay. So let's just have that out in the mix. And what I'd like to do is turn to an example of a what I would consider a political stained glass window. This is in Hong Kong's St. John's Cathedral, the Anglican cathedral in up up the hill in central Hong Kong. And so it's a triptych kind of window, and it's a marvelous piece. In the center is what? Jesus calming the storm, right? Standing in the boat, calming the storms. And you see the waves are quite intense there. But here on the left side is a British merchant marine. And the vessels on the water are those merchant ships. And then on the right is a Chinese fisherwoman. And above are the traditional Chinese fishing boats and vessels of trade. So this window is a prayer for the Lord to calm the waters that are full of turmoil. Now, this is at the time when the British were still ruling Hong Kong, and it was actually even, I think this window was before the Chinese Revolution, and before the Japanese takeover of Hong Kong for a time before the British came back. But just that stance of Jesus, calm the storm, please, here between these contesting powers and contesting people trying to do something, is a political prayer. Now, the British being the ones who have built this building, the prayer has a certain position to it in and of itself in this window. Please calm things down. Right. Keep things calm is one way of viewing how this might play out. So, in our churches, there are political statements already. If you go to Meade Memorial in Alexandria, the windows are with an African American Christ, and there are the depictions of biblical scenes in basically that part of Old Town Alexandria. This is a way of thinking about our life engaged in the public square, in the polis, the Polis, the city. When we talk about issues that people are facing, it is political. Now, another point to stress with political is the political becomes contentious if there is not a relationship that undergirds the conversation. And so if I start to converse about the shooting, and I start to speak about all of the political ramifications that have a certain partisan feel because of perhaps my frame of reference, but there is no relationship to any of the people that are involved. It is detached, and so then becomes distasteful in and of itself that way. A church that takes political stances but does not engage in relationships with the people and the issues that are at hand, it will be looked at askance. And a preacher who preaches about political issues but does not engage in the work will be tolerated only so long. So if I may, I'd like to also pull up one more slide for you to look at. This is a quote. Well, actually, yeah, I'll just read this quote quickly. I won't linger on this slide, though. This is a quote from Willis Jenkins, who's an ethicist. Some Christian social thought of recent decades uses existing poverty to leverage its denunciation of market globalization, ignoring the role that markets have played in reducing impoverishment. Absolute and relative rates of poverty have declined as more people participated in the global market. The decline was not nearly as much as wealth would allow, and market globalization continues to harm and entrap many people. Neither a salvific process nor the beast of Babylon, the market, is an ambivalent institution. Now, the market is a power force, and like any power force enacted, any agency that we enact, power is in and of itself ambivalent, right? And so the results can be easily judged or overjudged as all good or all bad, right? But let's face it, we live in an ambivalent world. And so to be able to speak to the ambivalence is profoundly important. Now, last thing I want to, this was on a slide that was about the pastor and prophet dichotomy. The pastor-prophet dichotomy is, it can show up in our preaching and in our manner of pastoral leadership. An overly pastoral stance is, let's all get along, right? And y'all are wonderful, and let's run down the street holding hands, right? And an overly prophetic stance is, there are just things that I've got to say to y'all, and you're going to listen, right? These are distortions of the terms, but we hear them play out. I was just talking to one of the canons in New York who said, you know, we've seen a turn this post-election to what he was terming as political preaching, but it was really partisan preaching. And it's not just partisan, but it's my partisan preaching. Because that's the frame of reference we often go to when we think political, is all or nothing thinking, either all good or all bad. My frame of reference, not the collective frames of reference of the community that I represent. And then the last thing I want to point out here is it's not just in our preaching and in our own personal action of the political realities, but it's, sorry, I need to make this on the screen here. This is an examination of the ways that we try to help, right? From direct service. So the kinds of things that congregations do are themselves political as well. If we do a soup kitchen, if we offer the homeless space, we are engaging in political action. But it's different than, as you go across to the right here, advocacy and direct action. On this side are the more pastoral, happy, everybody is happy to do good things for other people. But it doesn't necessarily change the circumstances of the people that we're trying to help, right? A constant or chronic direct relief is its own kind of problem, right? But as you move along the spectrum here, you are in essence engaging in a process of helping people exercise their own power. And through that, finding means to speak back to and to leverage a place in and against the powers that they experience coming at them, right? We are generally, as churches, happy to do the work of direct service, self-help, and education. But it's when we get into advocacy and direct action where there is an attempt to solve the upstream issues, if you will, that things get more contentious and heated. And so this ends up looking a little bit like this, right? We're happy to do the giving a fish to a hungry person, or even the teaching how to fish. It's when we're talking about securing rights for fishing access and waterways back to the window that we started with in Hong Kong, that things get heated and contentious. So how do we engage those conversations? Do we just stay on this side of the spectrum trying to address just the immediate needs of people and maybe a little self-development work with individuals as the work of the church? Or is there work for the church to do to engage issues of power misuse or power misplacement or barriers that exist in society to people exercising their power more fully in the public square? Once we begin to engage those questions, things get more heated. And this is where I think I want to hand it off to the next. Is that all right?
Whoa.
You want to do it?
What do you think?
Okay. Whichever. How do you feel? Do you want to go next or not?
You didn't know I was setting you up.
Okay, all right. Let's broader. Okay,
Okay.
I'll take it. Okay. Okay. Thank you, Brother David, for deepening my despair. Thank you, David, for that, doing that.
Do my best.
It's excellent. I'd like to talk with you in the context that David has set up, about being effective in delivering a political, talking about politics in the pulpit. And I think that as David started with an understanding of politics, I'd like to start with an understanding of politics. And I think that for us and what we do, it's important to know that politics, the word politics and the word liturgy actually mean the same thing. It's the work of the people. It's what people do. And so in that case, it's benign, and any sermon that doesn't get to the point of what people do is probably not worth listening to. So the idea that you could not be political in that sense of the term and preach a sermon that was worth anybody's time, I think is foolish. All sermons are political. All sermons are about our common life. But this panel is based on a certain understanding of politics, which is that it is a point of sensitivity. And it is the sensitivity that is the art form of being able to speak to the political situation. It's because people are sensitive about certain areas in the more defined understanding of politics that David has developed really well, that I would like for you to think with me for a few moments. So how do you do that? How do you come to that point? It is about sensitivity. You may be familiar with the novels of Mary Lynn Robinson, who wrote, this is a trilogy that's quite wonderful, Gilead, Home, and Lila. And in the third of those, Lila, this wisdom is there. The context doesn't matter because I think the statement stands on its own. The statement is, when you have been scalded, touching hurts, even if it was meant as a kindness. Okay? As a political people, we are scalded. And so even the touch, even if it's meant as a kindness, it hurts people. And it's the hurting of people that makes it difficult to talk about a political situation, because our politics have scalded us. Our life together has scalded us and raised certain issues to become trigger issues or to become points of clear sensitivity. And it's about that sensitivity that I think that our understanding of our role as preachers needs to be held. And a couple of things about that. One is that, to dress up like God and stand 10 feet over people's heads and give your political opinions is hardly fair. Okay, it's not that to say, God and I have this worked out, and here's what we've said is not cool and not appreciated, nor should it be. Because we might think of sermons as dialogical, but basically they're not. They're monological, and so it's important that we have some sensitivity about that. The other is that anytime we're preaching. Anytime we're in a context of preaching, there are always more people listening than there are speaking. So if you really want to understand what's going on, you have to understand listening. The art that we have is really not about public speaking. It's good to be in touch with your inner muse and do your own wordsmithing and the inner poet within you, and all of those things come out. And that's I'm sure a source of joy in heaven, but not necessarily in the congregation, because in the congregation, the art form is listening. How do these people listen? That's the question. How can I speak truth to people who listen this way? That if this word drives people nuts, they're not going to hear the words that follow it. So quite often when we presume to talk about politics as sensitivity, that we treat it as if it were a dialogue when it's not. We baptize our political opinions, and we take an unfair stance, and we are touching scalded people, and it hurts them. I don't think that's anything like the gospel of Jesus Christ. I really don't. No matter how convinced you and I might be of the God-centered righteousness of our view about House Bill 607 or whatever it is you're talking about, whatever that is, that's not fair. That falls well below the expectation of a Christian community, and God knows it's below the expectation of a Christian leader. There's a point of sensitivity here. So how do we become effective in that? Every sermon should be political. And every sermon, many sermons, not every, but many sermons need to move towards those points of sensitivity. There was a suggestion that we should be concerned about gun violence because of the thing today. If you're going to preach about what happened today in Alexandria, you kind of have to go there. And it's a point of sensitivity for lots of people. So the question is, in terms of effective preaching, how do you go there? Well, one of the things that cannot be replaced is the trust level you have with the congregation you serve. Whether the congregation really trusts you to understand them. And one of the principles there that is absolutely irreplaceable for those of you who are in parish ministry is that if you establish yourself as a pastor, you can do almost anything as a prophet. But if you do not establish yourself as a pastor, nobody will listen to you as a prophet. Now, I'm retired. I'm basically a guest preacher. Everybody knows I'm leaving, so they don't care what I say. So that's not a problem. But you all are staying, So if people don't know that you listen, that you understand, that you seek to understand, that you can listen so that you can state their position to their satisfaction, that you really understand them, that trust level is absolutely essential. If you haven't got it, then don't presume that you have it, okay? Don't pretend that you have it. So the trust level is really important, and the trust level is established in the sermons you preach, in the examples that you give, the understanding that those examples represent, and also in the cocktail party conversation, in the coffee hour conversation, everywhere. The trust level is built or destroyed in all of those contexts. So your role as a prophet is in direct relationship to your role as a pastor. If you're not a pastor, you'll never be a prophet in that place. People will cut you off at the knees, and you will have deserved it. Now, the other thing is that, in terms of of how to be effective. There's an interesting book that it's called Cosmopolitanism, and it was written by a man named Kwame Appiah. And I had to look it up because I embarrassed myself by never remembering the man's name. Kwame Appiah. And he talks about the essence of cosmopolitanism, and he says this about a cosmopolitan understanding of the world, that you can take, he says that a cosmopolitan can take any two positions, like here and here, and that you can draw a line through them, and they will converge at some point. And that the conversation needs to begin at the point of convergence, not at the point where they're met. And when we have a conversation that says, you think, let's take, the gun violence, and so, here's the where I think, I would be on the liberal end of that argument, and so. I think that we ought to get guns off the street, and I got my friend from the NRA who thinks that everybody had guns. That if the baseball players had been using machine guns instead of bats, they'd have been safe or something. But so and we have nothing that we can do with that. But when you draw a line through it, we're both concerned about the safety of our community and our families. So the conversation starts there, not here. And it may never get to here, but if you want to have a good conversation, it begins at that cosmopolitan point of convergence, not, I'm right, you're wrong, you're, anything like that. So, so the conversation, whether it's a homiletic conversation, wants to establish the common ground that we have. For us as theologians and in that theological construct, when we talk about politics, I think we need to begin with the principles, the theological principles, to which all sides of a debate are accountable. It's something that we all, we are all. It is possible to say, that in Genesis, that God gives us responsibility for creation, and that we have an established role as responsible stewards of creation. Yes, that's okay. I got that. Now, what does that mean in terms of global warming? Well, we might differ about that, but we do know that we have some responsibility here. So you start at the point of agreement, or the start of principle to which we are all accountable, and then you go from there as far as you possibly can. Now, that I think is another piece of it. The other piece that I want to suggest is that while sermons are thought to be dialogical, they are in fact monological. But the point that I want us all to remember is that the most important sermon, and in many instances the only important sermon, is the one that people preach to themselves when you sit down. Make something happen in the heads of the people who are in the room. Now, it may be that they say, gee, Frank is a genius. I'm so glad I heard that. That has not been a universal response, I want to say. But the point is, make something happen in their heads. So I think that the point that I want to hold before us is it's not about politics and preaching as if they were poles apart. All preaching is political. All preaching is about how people live. That's what politics really means. And the question before us is effective political preaching. And it's understanding that the politics that is the problem of this panel is sensitivity. How do you speak? How do you touch the scalded people? That is worthy of our thought and our prayer. Thank you.
Thank you. Is this one on?
So this has worked out perfectly because we're going to now zoom down to one pastor's experience of preaching in one particular context. This is beautiful. St. Philip's Episcopal Church, founded in 1861 in Richmond, Virginia. It's an interesting year for an African American church to be founded. The short story is that St. James's, which is a very large, affluent congregation in the Fan, if you know Richmond, had a colored Sunday school for the children that a group of white women would have known. Those would have been the children of their freed or enslaved domestic workers. That began in the 1840s, and it grew to several hundred children. And the families were like, wow, we love this. Our children are being baptized, they're being confirmed, they're learning about the Lord. We want to join. And the answer was, well, that's great, except it's 1861, and it's Richmond, Virginia, and the Civil War is just about to start. You can't join St. James's. But what we will do is to plant a separate church. And we'll pay for your priest and your buildings and your upkeep until you can sort of get up on your feet. And so we were a mission congregation of St. James's for maybe 15 years. And then we became a diocesan mission. We're in the Diocese of Virginia. And then in 1920, we attained parish status. History is complicated in Richmond. We were originally in a small wooden building, and when it burned down, Jeb Stewart's son paid to build a new one. Go figure, right? We have been at this location since 1959. This is North Richmond. We were planted in Jackson Ward, which is the historically black section of Richmond. This church was actually built by another Episcopal church in our diocese, the Church of the Epiphany, which is now on Hermitage Road. They built it in 1929, so it was about 30 years old when the diocese facilitated the transfer. I have been there for 6 years. I have 300 members. I have an ASA of 140 and over 2 services, and I have buried 60 people in 6 years. So what Frank said is so true. I have put in the pastoral care. I'm the only priest. I'm the only full-time employee. I have a part-time administrative assistant, a part-time sexton, and a part-time director of music. Everyone else, from the Sunday school coordinator to the youth group coordinator to the stewardship coordinator to the outreach coordinator, they're all volunteers. So I'm at the size parish where they want me everywhere, and I am everywhere to the extent that I can be. So this is our beautiful church, and it looks like, let's see, is this me? Perfect. And we have a red door. And we are established in 1861. We welcome you. We're very clear that we are part of the Anglican Communion. And you'd walk in, and this is our altar. And people who were with Epiphany, who occasionally come back with photos from the 1930s and 40s, very little about this altar area has changed. So this all looks just like any other church, right? In thinking about what is political or partisan, I have to say it's extremely contextual. We are a historically black congregation. I have 1 Latino deacon and maybe 3 or 4 white members. Everyone else is of African origin, but that is very deceptively homogenous because I have people from Central America, South America, the Caribbean, and Africa, in addition to African Americans sitting in my pews. So once you start talking to people, you hear accents. There's a great diversity in terms of liturgical styles and world perspective, but it's a bunch of black folk, basically, right? But because this building was built in 1929, all of the images and all of the stained glass in this beautiful worship space depict Europeans, even Judas. There is no one in the biblical narrative, if we just had this space, who looks like anybody who sits in my pews, right? So it is a physical space that does not affirm our humanity, just by definition. Clearly, we weren't created in God's image because we're not up there. So this is the passageway leading from the worship space into our parish hall. And you'll see a number of things. We've got some directions. We're trying to do better about signage. We want to welcome guests. We have our poster from the Diocese of Virginia. We're advertising VBS. We put all sorts of notices about community activities and functions. And you will also see this particular Black Lives Matter poster, which I was approached about a couple of years ago. Could we put this up on the bulletin board? That might be seen as not only a political statement, but a partisan statement. In my context, this is a theological statement. I have 20 young persons who are actively involved in my youth group and acolytes, 15 of whom are boys, right? So I have 2 Trayvon Martins who are my crucifers and 3 or 4 Tamar Rices who are carrying the torch. Maybe you don't have that in your context. That isn't bad or good. It is what it is. But regardless of whether my members are politically conservative or they're politically liberal, they have Black sons and grandsons and nephews, and they are terrified to death about what will happen to them. So they weren't trying to make a big political statement. They are afraid, and they said, this is an organization that it is at least raising this issue. We're scared. Can we put it up? So it went up. And at the time that it did go up, there was no backlash at all about it. What else do we have? We have, and you'll see this in some of the other pictures, put up in the parish hall and in other parts of the church, images that do affirm our humanity. So we have a picture of Mary and Jesus, and we also have this large framed piece of art that comes from President Obama's 2008 campaign, and I will just zoom in on it. Now, you might say, clearly this is partisan. Well, let me tell you a little bit about how we got this. I do have a small number of Republicans who are members of my congregation, and I have to say that they have felt almost like people without a party. They did not support the Democratic nominee. They did not support the Republican nominee. They were saddened that they didn't feel like they had anybody. We also have a strong history of working with the Richmond City Jail and Buckingham Correctional Facility. Prison ministry has been an active part of our life together. And because of that relationship, right? Wow, we didn't even know that, we didn't even compare notes before we did this. But because of that relationship, the inmates of the Richmond City Jail made this poster in their spare time. And they gave it to us as a thank you for our ministry with them. And again, regardless of where my members fall on the political spectrum, because 96% of them are of African origin, they are proud of the fact that this son of Africa was elected to the highest office in the United States. Not as a political statement, but just we're proud. And if you zoom in even closer, all of those small photographs of Frederick Douglass, Dr. Martin Luther King, Jackie Robinson, Harriet Tubman, President Obama, Fannie Lou Hamer were compressed. I don't know if I can go back, right? As you step back with the distance to do that. So again, the closer that you get to it, it's history. I was asked, can we put it up? It went up. It didn't raise a ripple. And that wouldn't work in every context. but it works for us. Some other things we have, and again, this was up before I came, we have a framed map of the continent of Africa. We don't have all of the parts of the world where we are most recently from, but clearly most of us who are there are from somewhere in Africa. We also have this, we have several maps of African queens and kings up in the parish hall. How another group relates or is impacted by these sorts of images when they come in, I'm not sure, but it works for us in our context. I will say that I have been more vocal about addressing difficult issues the longer I've been at St. Philip's. And 2 years ago, for our Easter Sunday sermon, I was quite convicted. This was when I believe Indiana had done the Religious Freedom Act, which allowed persons to not serve gays and lesbians because of a feeling that that lifestyle was an affront to God. And I had written a very traditional Easter Sunday sermon, and I was just convicted by the Holy Spirit on Saturday night that I couldn't deliver that sermon, which, if you know anything about me, like, that's not me, right? Spirit doesn't normally work with me in that way. And I stayed up most of the night, thanks be to God, really grappling with what can I say. And I walked into the pulpit on Sunday morning with the Bible and the Quran. And I sort of just said at the beginning, and the church was packed. This is Easter Sunday, right? So I wasn't sure if I was going to get a pink slip at the end of this. I said, if you haven't met me, I'm Mother Phoebe, I'm the rector here, and this may be your introduction to St. Philip's. This is not going to be a traditional Easter Sunday message, and this isn't even in the norm with how I am as a person, but I'm just feeling convicted. Maybe I went against everything that Frank just said, but what I said was, if we are going to pass laws and make statements based upon Scripture, can we at least be consistent and not pick and choose which sexual sins, in quotes, we have deemed so significant that a business will not serve the person, right? I said, in my Bible, Jesus doesn't talk about homosexuality, but he does talk about fornication, and he does talk about adultery, and he does talk about divorce, right? And some of those teachings are really hard. So if we really are saying as businesses or people that we don't want to have anything to do with persons who are engaged in a lifestyle that is not pleasing with God, I could have understood the law if all of those categories were also included, and they weren't. And so what I'm struggling with is how we as people of faith pick and choose in both of these texts what we're going to emphasize and what we're not. And I said, I don't have the answer, but I'm really grappling with this. And I have to say that I got more favorable comments from my members from that sermon than almost any sermon that I've done, in part because Ruth Anna and Judith McDaniel were both my homiletics professors, but I probably drunk a little bit more from the Judith well when I was here. For those of you who know Judith McDaniel, she's a very gifted teacher, and she does not like the first pronoun I. And the use of that word in a sermon would immediately get a C or below. And I didn't want a C, right? So I didn't use that word. And in my first congregation for 3 years, I rarely used the word I. I'm not sure they really knew who I was when I left, right? And after 3 or so years in this context, I did begin to say I. And the people were like, oh gosh, for the first time, we see you and something that you're passionate about. Even if they didn't agree, they said we could feel you. And that's what we want. We want to know you. We want to be in relationship with you. So 6 years in and many funerals and weddings and all of those sorts of things, I could do that. I also would say that when I came, I was clear with the search committee that my job as a priest and pastor extended beyond 2900 Haynes Avenue, and that it was really important for me to do things in the community. And anytime that I give a lecture or a speech or a presentation that's open to the public, it's in the bulletin. So if I'm going to preach at the installation of a new rector in town, it's in the bulletin. If I'm going to be on a panel at VCU about women in faith, it's in the bulletin. When I gave the invocation before the General Assembly, it was in the bulletin. And so then when last year I went to a rally or a march at the Islamic Mosque on South Side, in solidarity with our Muslim brothers and sisters, it was just in the bulletin. And some people saw it, some people asked me about it, and guess what? 5 people showed up with me. So I've been very transparent, not only when I'm doing things that are political, but anytime I'm speaking outside of the walls of St. Philip's and it's open to the public, they know. So I think they've just come to sort of understand that about me. So I would say transparency in what's on your calendar outside of the church so that they're not reading about it in the news or they turn on the TV. Oh, wow, what's Mother doing at that rally? There are a lot of cameras there. They weren't surprised because it was in the bulletin. So being authentic about the things that are of great interest and concern to me, I've learned has made me more relatable and people are more comfortable engaging. And maybe it's because I'm in a context where most of the people are politically on one side of the spectrum. I think if I were in a congregation that was more evenly split, it might be more difficult. But they have been very responsive because I think they know me and the relationship is there. So even if they don't agree, they still are willing to be in dialogue with me. So I think with that, I'm going to sit down.
Phoebe, I was really struck by what you just shared about your congregation knowing you, and in particular about how some of your seminary training pushed against that or inhibited that. Because I'm beginning to realize that sometimes I feel that too, in the sense that boundaries are important, and I'm an introvert and I need my space, and I think that's part of being a healthy clergy person. And in some cases, not all cases, but sometimes I have been in the habit of biting my tongue or biting my cheek in terms of sharing something that's important to me when I'm afraid it would offend someone under my care. We were just talking about that a little bit earlier in small group. So I think it takes a certain amount of courage, but I also think it's healthy for our people to know us as much as we need to know them as their pastors and be pastors to them. So I'm wondering if you could expand on that a little bit more, and I certainly open that up to Frank and David as well, ways that you have found to, in a healthy fashion, share yourself with your congregation as you seek to be their pastor, so that they can know you and perhaps know some of your stances that might unsettle them a little bit, but are authentically who you are.
Yeah, so I'll start. I don't want us to lose our tax exempt status. So I've never ever in a sermon said anything about a particular political candidate. In the Black church tradition, around election season, a lot of folks want to come and make announcements. I don't allow that. I mean, if we wanted to do sort of a panel with all the candidates in a race after the service, I would do that. But when people call, I say, you're welcome to worship. If you want to stay afterwards and greet people individually in the coffee hour, you can do that, but you can't stand up. I will also say, Nick, that I practice self-care. I'm in two Richmond clergy support groups. One is with Episcopal clergy and one is with Northside clergy of multiple denominations. I'm also in a clergy support group with several African-American female priests from around the country. We meet twice a year in various locations, and I have a spiritual director and I have a therapist. So I'm very clear that I cannot work through all of my stuff on Sunday morning at 10:30 in the pulpit. So I think my work with my therapist has actually helped give me the confidence to say, now that you've worked through some of this stuff and you've been through all those different stages of anger, blah, 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 I think you're okay with saying some of this stuff. So my therapist has really been helpful. So make sure that you're taking care of yourself. Right?
Well, I think that actually this is part of the homily tomorrow morning, so get up early, Nick, and go over it. But I think that being known and allows, like with Phoebe's thing, clearly the trust level is very high there and mutually held in terms of that community. But I'm not sure that the sermon is the only place to be known. There are lots of ways to be known, lots of interactions, and I'm not sure that as Phoebe said, that the 10 o'clock on Sunday morning is a place to work out your inner demons or whatever they are. So I think it's important to do that, to be known. That's how trust builds. Trust builds on the basis of knowledge and understanding. I think that's an important thing to do. I'm not sure that the homily is the only, and quite often, nor is it the best place to indicate what's going on with you. It is a wonderful place to indicate how well you understand the people to whom you are speaking, which is an important part of trust, but not necessarily that everybody needs to know that you were born in a log cabin and raised, by wolves or whatever your story happens to be. So, I Googled you. I had to, but there are different ways to do that. So. Yep.
Within sermons, there are moments of offering the vulnerable view of yourself, contending with an issue.
Yeah, I think
that can be profoundly important for people to hear, and that coincides with a way of leading. In general, so it's not just something you do from the pulpit, but a way of inviting people into difficult conversation is to indicate your own wrestling with it. So that has been helpful for me at moments. The other thing is, when something happens, it really isn't acceptable to not say something about it. So I was in one church where it was prior to Desert Storm and prior to our announcement to launch into Desert Storm, and it just on the cusp of it, and then suddenly we were in it, or we were moving into it, and one Sunday went by and there was nothing from the rector, and another Sunday went by and there was nothing from the rector, and then it was my turn to preach, and I did say some things, and there was just such a relief from the congregation. Even if people disagreed with some of the things I said, there were others who were glad that something was said, and there was this kind of impromptu candlelight vigil protest along the road that evening that emerged from the congregation that day. So, yeah, those are the two things I would say.
So this is an observation more than a question, and I'd love to, if anybody has something to say in response. But what I'm hearing really kind of from the three of you is that this isn't just about what you do politically or what you say in the pulpit politically, but it's also about who you're with and where you are. And so and I was thinking about that in terms of Jesus, and that for most of the most of the gospel, the first 30 years of his life, there's very little that he does or says. It's mostly him being with the people of Nazareth. And then he starts to get into action for 3 years. And so, I think about, Phoebe, what you were the way that you're with your people, and how that allows you to, put things up on the wall that are honoring them and their heritage. So, so I just offer that as an observation and wonder, if anyone has anything to say about that.
I'm thinking about the other church that's been going through some of its decor matters
in Richmond.
In Richmond.
And we've been part of that. Yeah. St. Paul's Episcopal Church in downtown Richmond, it's like a block from the General Assembly and the State House, which was the Cathedral of the Confederacy. Robert E. Lee has his pew there and his Tiffany stained glass window. He is depicted as Moses in the window, which is priceless. No, I mean literally, to even insure it, right? But again, relationship. When Trayvon Martin was killed, I was sitting at St. Philip's wondering, how are we going to process this? And we're predominantly people of color. There's a whole group of partners who aren't at the table. And because I had done Credo with Wallace Adams Riley, he was at St. Paul saying, how are we going to process this as a predominantly white, affluent, former Cathedral of the Confederacy congregation? And so he and I met for coffee, and we started a 3-year journey that began with both congregations going back and forth for dinners and panel discussions, and we watched movies, and we walked a portion of the Richmond Slave Trail together, and then the youth groups from the two congregations began doing service projects together and worshiping together, and the culmination of that and a lot of other work that they were doing led them to remove many of those outward symbols from the worship space. They will be put in another room in the church, sort of as a museum. And yet the things that really are priceless, such as the Tiffany window, they are going to leave as it is. But it was the relationship between two priests and each of us really agonizing over, this young man has been murdered. What sense can we make of that led two congregations to walk together for several years?
The congregation itself,
And
with
it
the
continued.
clergy leadership, entered into conversation with each other over a long period about these windows and about symbols and what they represent and history of symbols. I mean, your community has brought in symbols that speak to your community. You said you didn't know necessarily how visitors see them because they don't know the story behind.
Correct.
And then there's this other story behind. But now St. Paul's has had to revisit the story. And so the story is being retold in a new way. And that is giving them, in a way, new power over the symbol that they have to live with in their presence.
And it's been a very difficult journey, and they've had to bring in consultants. I mean, the contention and the hate emails and letters and calls that the clergy got for starting this journey, they've paid a tremendous price for it. Yeah.
Okay, so a little while ago, you said when something happens, it's not okay not to say anything about it. And I would have agreed with you a year ago. But now something happens every week. And so I'm wondering, like, I mean, I'm not kidding. Like, I mean, from Paris, like, I just looking back over the last 30 days, there's so much to choose from. And I guess I just wonder about, I guess I want to put that question in conversation with make something happen in their heads when they sit down. So at this point, I don't know, what's the convergence point what am I going to make? And I am in a very divided, not a divided, I'm in a place where we are not purple. We are red and we are blue. And we are both together in the pews. And I'm proud of that. I'm proud that they are hanging tight with each other. But it makes addressing anything really, really tough. And so I turn into can't we all just get along and sing happy songs down the street? I'm doing a lot of avoidance, I guess.
Well, I think that I think you can wear out a point by addressing it every week. I think that there's in the life of a parish, because you're there consistently, that you need a little variety, and that if the sermon is the same one every week, there was the old show Hee Haw used to have a summary of the news, and it was wonderful. The summary of the news was the news today is the same it was yesterday. It just happened to different people. So if you're basically giving the same sermon and with interchangeable people, after a while, what are we doing here? So while the news and these things are truth, there are many truths. And the fact that those people are in the same building in this deeply divided country is news worth celebrating. I don't know where you are, but I think that that's a point that might be applauded as opposed to setting them after one another. I mean, there are many truths to proclaim, and I don't offer that as a tactic of avoidance, but the word that I wanted to hold before you was being effective about political state, politics and preaching. So I think there are many truths, and that will establish your right to speak to certain truths at different times. And it's a matter of choosing. But I mean, it sounds to me like a wonderful thing has been accomplished, and that those all behavior has a payoff. And all congregations are made up of volunteers. Nobody has to be there. Those people are choosing to be together in a world that's choosing to be apart. That should be applauded and celebrated in wherever you are.
I'd a number of years back, a colleague of mine, John Drybelbus, and I did a study of Episcopal rectors and vicars. And in this massive survey we sent out, we asked some questions about preaching as well, and asked, how often do you do any of the following? Do you tell a story from your own life, going back to some of what we were talking about earlier? Do you talk about something local that has happened? Do you talk about something national, international? And do you make some reference to the arts or movies or something like that? Well, which do you think were the most frequent? Arts, movies, self, and then international, national. Local tends to be less attended to in the sermon, and yet this is in some ways the most directly in relation to people's lives. What's happening with the school board? What's happening with, and these are political matters that have importance and interact with the life of faith. And in a way that intersects with another principle from community organizing that chasing after the big issues constantly is not necessarily where the people's will is. You have to actually listen to where people's interests are to figure out what the issues are that you need to work on. And so, what are the people talking about that matters to them locally, that's issue driven?
I wanted to ask a question, so I'm going to hold on to the mic for a second. Phoebe, you brought up something that I've asked every speaker this week, and that is, if the IRS rule changes, will your preaching change? And I'll tell you that everybody else has said no, not in any way. What will you say if the rule changes?
No, it would not. I still think I agree with Frank, for me to stand up and sort of say who I'm supporting or encourage overt during the liturgy support of one candidate over the other, I would not do that.
And even if every other church in town is doing it,
No.
people are hearing it from them?
No, because most of the black churches in Richmond, they do allow political candidates to stand up and during the announcements to give their 15-minute campaign speech. So we're already an outlier in that we don't allow that.
Great.
Yeah.
Father Frank,
Yes, sir.
we started working with a community organizer ourselves, and so one of the things that I was concerned about is, wanted to know about is how does that shape preaching when you start to get to the point where you're starting to deal with those lightning rods that you placed upon the board there, and we saw. Because that's when it really starts to heat up and people really become involved and tension starts to happen within the life of the parish. And could you speak to that a little bit?
Let me make sure that I understand what you're saying. So because you're working in community organization and you're getting into those local issues that David talked about that people are invested in, there's a lot of tension around that. Good people are on opposite sides, and that's a tension that's within the congregation as well. How do you speak to that, right? Okay, so I think that I would take a lesson from Kwame Appiah, and if there were tensions in a congregation about an issue, I would talk about how people live and deal with tension rather than from the pulpit. About how people live and deal with tension and what our Lord calls us to do in terms of dealing with tension, as opposed to what we're going to do about affordable housing or something like that. So I think that for myself, that the proper homiletic addressing of that is about the human condition that we share and how do we navigate this as human beings who want to get along. There are other forums, which would be like an adult forum or a meeting or those gatherings and all that kind of place, to talk about whether affordable housing should be here or there or not at all. And all. I mean, there's another place to do that, but I think that the sermon has a particular power and a particular limit, in that context. If I understand your question, that's my response to it. So tell me if we're talking to each other.
David, you placed it up there. How would you address that?
Addressing the tension that arises.
The tension that arises, and also speaking to that within the context of preaching and it's setting people on a course for change and to really address issues within their community.
It's a little bit like coming to a vestry meeting with a vote without having talked to people beforehand. Not a good idea, right? You do the meetings before the meetings in some ways, and so the work of organizing and coalescing a community is long work, and never done, and always shifting, and that's true for the organizers working with multiple groups, and for people in a congregation or a principal with teachers in a school. There's always constantly reshaping and whatnot. So, and tensions arise. So it's how you're able to foster the conversation in a variety of settings that will set the stage for being able to speak something then from the pulpit at what is the right time.
Go ahead.
I think that just in terms of leadership in a system like this, and this is not about any particular issue, it's just a general thing I would hold before you, that if you want to bring about change in terms of focus and that sort of thing, that a mistake that people commonly make is that they sell a solution before they sell a problem. And the point is, sell the problem, and then people will buy the solution. But if people don't think they have a problem, they're not going to be interested in the solution you should come up with. So that's just, kind of a aphorism or something. So as it applies to this, that if we can agree that whatever this thing is a problem, then we can have a pretty ready conversation about solutions. The most popular illustration of that is in the musical The Music Man, where the guy comes to town and he's a shyster, he's a complete crook, but we're going to baptize his crookedness and bring it over to our purposes. But what he does is that he first thing he does is that he tells them that they got a problem, which is a pool table in town. And when he gets the whole town saying trouble, 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 then he says, boys band, that's what we need. And that, while he is not to be, Harold Hill is not to be commended as a saint, and if you ever need to replace one of those stained glass windows, Harold Hill might be the guy. But I think that the tactical point is, sell the problem, then you can sell the solution. And a lot of mistakes that people in zeal and whatever make is that they want to sell solutions before they've actually sold the problem. And I think that's a leadership issue, not necessarily a homiletic issue.
Along that line, sorry, just one method that I have used occasionally is the what if problem. Posing the problem as, or presenting something to people with a what if kind of scenario. What if you were employed with a wage at $8 an hour? How would you find rent? How would you, and on the other side, even posing the solution as a what if endeavor, inviting people to explore it together as a possibility. The other is to invite people into encounter directly with people, so that those people give voice to the situation that they're facing directly. St. Peter's in the Woods in Fairfax Station is a wonderful congregation, but high representation of more Tea Party kind of aligned folks who wouldn't necessarily be keen for handout kind of things. But then they started doing some relief work in the community and began to encounter families of veterans that couldn't make ends meet, and even when employed. And as they heard the stories, they said, no, we have to do something about this. And so they began to enter into a community organizing kind of model. You wouldn't have expected this at all, but it was because of the direct encounter.
So how do you talk about power in the pulpit? Power. And there are a couple angles that I'm curious about. One is the power of the church as a mediating institution. Right now we're in a cultural situation where most of our mediating institutions have been corroded for a variety of reasons. And so the middle power that those institutions occupied has seemed to had an impact upon our public generally, negatively. I find that most Christians are uncomfortable with that word. And so I'm curious to know about how you might address that from the pulpit. Granted, maybe not using the word power, but there might be other ways to talk about that. And the second thing is, are there resources in our spirituality that you find can help us talk about things like tension or being present with people who disagree with us, or rebuilding institutions that you think maybe we're not using as much as we could? Okay, because my intuition is that there's some pretty deep Anglican roots that can allow us to be in the public in a way that is nonpartisan, that we're not always using or examining. So.
I'll start with the power question. One verse that we quote a fair amount at St. Philip's is that I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. So I do try to discuss the use of power as originating from God. And because of that, how can it be used in ways to God's honor and glory, even above our own? And to ask people sometimes to reflect back, because oftentimes we can only see things in hindsight. If you can reflect back on your past and you can see in hindsight how God was working and how God empowered you to do certain things, then can you build upon that as you are considering future challenges or, challenges that you're in the midst of right now? So I don't think we shy away from power, but I try to always link it to Christ.
I think it's a good question, and I thank you for it. Rollo May defined power as simply the ability to cause or prevent change. It is itself an amoral concept, and like politics, it gets freighted with power is something bad people do. People have power over me, that kind of stuff. And the fact is, if we had no power, we could not be moral human beings. So, I think that there's if you want to talk about something, there's a certain amount of, putting a ground wire on it, so that you can actually talk about it. So whether you actually use the word power or not, but it is in fact, an amoral, ubiquitous human capability. So there is a way to kind of diffuse it, as opposed to power is the mean people do and all that kind of stuff. So there's that. I think that the Scripture is full of people dealing with tensions, and so there are lots of examples, plenty of them bad, about people dealing with tensions. So I think that that Scripture, at the very least, legitimizes the question. Judas among the apostles, or the memory of Judas among the apostles, which is probably the more accurate piece of that. The fact that both John the Baptist and Jesus were killed because Herod and Pilate responded to public pressure in both cases. It is a matter of tension within a community where they caved, and so there's lots of ways to talk about tension, and good examples and bad examples, and so the tension between Peter and Paul. You can go all over the place with that, and again, the tension among people, is grows out of the simple fact that we're different. That God went to some trouble to make us individuals, and it really worked. We really are. We're really different, and tension is one of the facts of that reality. So I think the point is not to be not to be afraid of it, and to diffuse some of those things so that you can talk about it. So if you just say, we have this terrible tension problem here in the church, and we got to talk about that tension problem, everybody's going to say, yeah, right, I'm not going to talk. So it's a question of getting it down where it actually can be talked about, I think, whether that's homiletically or some other context, I don't know.
I'm not recalling the names right now of some of the current authors, and maybe Ruth, Anna, you remember some of those who are writing about conflict as a good and as a gift. And as in a way, a spiritual practice. Thank you. That's one. Yes. Yeah. So there are some authors in practical theology that are doing some really good work in that area in the past 10 years, and even some of the classics in conflict. intervention and conflict resolution talk about conflict in that way as well. So Fisher and Urey's getting to yes, or Urey when he stopped writing with Fisher. The Third Side is a quite good book that talks about the power of conflict, but also the power of the containing field for conflict to happen. And so building a community's muscles for the containing field is also part of the equation. The image that keeps returning to me is that power is not always from the obvious position, right? And any work with family systems is revelatory in that, right? Christ's kenotic power, the power of self-emptying, is an interesting exploration for people to take, to think about the power of a choice whereby you give yourself up over or yield intentionally with purpose in mind. Something to play with.
So I think maybe that brings us to 8:30, and we should stop there. But let's thank our panelists.